The axle broke 4 miles from anywhere, on a Thursday afternoon in November, in the particular way that axles break when they have been holding on longer than they should and the road gives them one rut too many. Celia Vance heard the crack before she felt it, a sound like a rifle shot under the wagon bed, and then the right rear corner dropped and the wagon lurched and she had the reins in both hands and the horses steadied before the whole thing tipped, which was the only piece of luck in the situation. She sat on the tilted seat and looked at the road ahead, which was empty, and the road behind, which was empty, and the flat November sky, which offered no opinion. She was 38 years old, and she had been a widow for 7 months, and she was moving herself and the contents of a wagon from the house in Caldwell that had been hers, and Arthur's to the house in Meade that was her sister's. Because the house in Caldwell had been sold to pay the debts Arthur had not told her about while he was alive, and because her sister had written in September to say there was room, and because Celia had looked at the options available to her and concluded that her sister's house was the least terrible of them. She had not wanted to go to her sister's house. She had not wanted any of the options available to her. She had wanted the life she'd had 6 months ago, which was not available. She climbed down from the tilted wagon and looked at the axle, which had snapped clean through just inboard of the wheel hub. She was not a woman who did not understand wagon mechanics. She understood exactly what she was looking at and exactly what it meant, which was that she was not going anywhere in this wagon today or tomorrow or until someone came along with either a spare axle or a conveyance to carry her to a place where such a thing might be obtained. The horses stood in harness and waited with the patient resignation of animals accustomed to human problems. She looked up the road, which ran across the flat toward a line of cottonwoods 1/2 mile distant. Beyond the cottonwoods, if she remembered the territory correctly from the journey out 3 years ago, there was a creek crossing. And beyond the creek crossing there was sometimes a property and sometimes not, depending on whether anyone had taken up the land in the interval. She unhitched the nearside horse, a bay gelding named Thomas, who was better mannered than his partner on a lead, and she left the offside mare ground tied to the tilted wagon with enough rope to be comfortable, and she set off toward the cottonwoods on the bay. She was not afraid. She noted this as she rode, because she thought she probably should be, and was not. And the absence of the fear she expected was itself a kind of information. She thought, I have already lost the worst thing. The road and the axle and the November sky are a problem. They are not the worst thing. She rode toward the cottonwoods and the creek and whatever was beyond them. His name was Owen Cole, and he had been alone on the Bitter Creek property for 2 years, which was a year longer than he had planned to be alone, but which had not arranged itself differently despite the plan. The property was 180 acres of decent grassland, with a creek that did not run dry in summer and a frame house that he had finished building in the spring of the first year, with the expectation that there would be someone to put in it. And then the someone had not materialized, and the house had sat with its 2 stories and its 4 rooms and its kitchen garden going to weeds for want of attention he could not give it, while also managing 180 acres alone. He was 40 years old. He had come from Missouri with enough money to buy the land and build the house and stock the place with cattle. And he had done all of these things, and what he had not done was find someone to share it with, not for want of trying, but for want of the right circumstance, and the frontier was not a place that produced right circumstances on a schedule a man could predict. He had neighbors 3 miles to the east who had a wife and 4 children and who were friendly and intermittently useful. He had another neighbor 6 miles to the west whom he had not met. Between him and the road to the south there was 4 miles of his own grassland, and then the road, and in 2 years he had seen perhaps 30 wagons on that road, most of them passing through toward somewhere that was not here. He was at the south fence line when he saw the rider coming across his grass. He saw, before anything else, that it was a woman. because the way she sat the horse was the way a woman who is not accustomed to riding astride sits a horse when riding astride is the option available to her, which is with a particular upright competence that is not quite the same as a man's ease. He set down the fencing pliers he had been holding, and he waited. She came up to the fence and stopped. She had dark hair and a gray traveling dress and an expression that had already assessed the situation before she arrived at it and was not going to waste his time or hers with anything unnecessary. "My wagon axle broke," she said. 4 miles south on the Mead Road. I have a mare tied to it." She looked at the fence between them and at him on the other side of it. "Is there a smithy within reasonable distance?" He told her there was not. He told her the nearest smith was in Granger, 12 miles east, and the road to Granger crossed Bitter Creek 2 miles north of where she was standing, and Bitter Creek had been running high since Monday's rain and was not crossable with a wagon even if she had one. She received this information without comment. She looked at the flat horizon in the direction of Granger, and then at the sky, and then back at him. "How long for the creek?" she said. 2 days, he said, maybe 3. She looked at the horse under her, the bay, who was a good horse but not her own horse, and who was standing in borrowed harness on a borrowed arrangement. "All right," she said. She looked at him. "Is there somewhere nearby I could put my horses for a few days?" He opened the gate. Her name, she told him on the walk back toward the house, was Celia Vance, and she was going to Mead to her sister's, and she did not elaborate on why she was going to her sister's, and he did not ask. He brought her to the barn first because that was where the horses needed to go, and she helped him unhitch the arrangement she had put the bay in, and she did it competently, which he noticed, and then they went together back to the tilted wagon to get the mare. The wagon was worse than he had expected from her description, which was to say, it was not going to be repaired with what was in his barn. The axle was a clean break at the hub, which was the kind of break that required a replacement axle and a replacement hub and more time than 2 days even if he had the parts. He looked at the wagon and then at what was in it: 2 trunks, a crate of household goods, several wrapped bundles, and a rocking chair that had been roped to the side and which had survived the lurch better than might be expected. He looked at the rocking chair. He did not say anything about the rocking chair. "I can bring the contents to the house," he said. "The wagon will have to wait for the creek." She looked at the trunks and the crate and the bundles and the rocking chair. "I can manage the trunks myself," she said. "If you have a cart." He had a cart. They moved the contents of the wagon in 2 trips, and she carried her share without waiting to be directed about what to carry, and the rocking chair went in the second load without comment from either of them, and by the time they were done the light was going and the temperature was dropping, and he stood in the yard with the question of supper and the reality of the house with its 4 rooms and what the situation required. She was standing in the yard looking at the house. He watched her look at it the way she had looked at the broken axle, without surprise, taking inventory of the facts as presented. "I can manage supper if you show me the kitchen," she said. He showed her the kitchen. She managed supper in the way of a woman who has managed kitchens and is not intimidated by a new one, moving through the space with the assessing efficiency of someone who prefers to orient herself by doing rather than by being shown. She found the flour and the salt pork and the dried beans and the cast-iron skillet hanging on the wall, and she went to work without asking him questions he could not answer better than she could answer herself. He set the table because it needed setting, and it was his kitchen and his table, and they ate supper together in the way of 2 people who have been thrown together by circumstance and are being decent about it. She did not speak much at supper. He did not speak much either, which was his habit and which suited the situation. When she did speak, it was specifically the quality of the beans from his root cellar, whether the pump at the well was reliable, what time the light typically went in November at this longitude. He answered each question accurately, and she received the answers and asked the next one. He thought, "This is a woman who thinks in practical terms because practical terms are what she has." He thought, "That is a kind of courage, the kind that is not bold but is steady," and steady, in his experience, lasted longer. After supper she washed the dishes without asking, and he dried without discussing it, and when it was done the kitchen was clean, and the evening was late, and he showed her to the upstairs room that had been built for occupation and had not been occupied in 2 years. She looked at it the way she looked at everything, systematically, without expression, and she thanked him without making more of it than it was, and she went in and closed the door. He stood in the hallway a moment. Through the door he could hear the small sounds of a person settling into an unfamiliar room, the particular sounds of someone making do with what is available and not complaining about it. He went downstairs. The house had a different quality to it than it had had this morning, fuller, somehow, in a way he could not name precisely, and not unpleasant. He banked the stove and went to bed. She stayed 2 days for the creek and a third, because the creek came down slower than he had predicted. In those 3 days he learned the following things about Celia Vance, not because she told him, but because 3 days of proximity in a house and a barn and a kitchen reveal a person, whether they intended or not, that she was a light sleeper who was up before him and had the stove going by the time he came downstairs. That she had a practical knowledge of cattle that went beyond what most women from a townhouse would have, which suggested her life before Arthur had included animals, that she could mend harness to a standard he was accustomed to doing himself, which he discovered on the second morning when he came into the barn and found her halfway through repairing a cracked collar strap with the leather punch from his tool shelf, that she moved through spaces quietly, efficiently, without taking up more room than she needed or requiring more attention than the situation called for, and that she was managing something that was not the broken axle, something interior and ongoing, with the same competent steadiness she brought to the harness and the stove and the supper. He did not ask about it. He recognized it because he had managed his own interior ongoing things for 2 years in the same way, which was by keeping moving and doing the work and not letting it be a conversation. He let her be what she was. She let him be what he was. They worked alongside each other in the kitchen and the barn and the yard with the easy parallel efficiency of people who have worked before and know how, and neither of them got in the other's way. On the third evening, after supper and the dishes and the quiet of a November night coming down, he was at the table with his accounts and she was mending by the lamp, and the silence between them was the good kind, the kind that does not need filling. He looked up from the accounts and looked at her in the lamplight, her head bent over the work, her hands moving with the small, precise movements of someone who knows what they are doing and does not perform the knowing. He thought about the house with its 4 rooms and the kitchen garden that went to weeds and the road to the south along which approximately 30 wagons had passed in 2 years. He thought about the creek coming down and what it would mean when it did. He set down his pen. "Celia," he said. She looked up. "Do you have anywhere to go?" he said, "when the creek comes down?" She held his eyes. She did not answer immediately. She set her mending in her lap, and she looked at him with the direct, taking stock expression she had worn when she looked at the broken axle, and at the house, and at the kitchen, and at everything he had shown her, and she was turning the question over the way she turned everything over, which was with her full attention and without hurrying. "My sister's house," she said. "In Mead." He waited. She looked at the mending in her lap. Then at the lamp. Then at him. "No," she said. "Not really. No." He held it. He held her eyes, and he held the no and what it contained, which was 7 months of widowhood and a house sold for debts and a wagon axle that had finally broken on a road going somewhere she did not want to go. and all of the managing she had done and the gap between what her life had been and what it was now. "No," he said, "is the most honest thing I've heard in a long time." She looked at him. "Now you do," he said. 3 words. He did not say anything else. He let them stand where he had put them, and he did not take them back, and he did not explain them, and he did not look away from her. She did not look away either. The lamp held steady between them. The stove ticked. Outside, the November wind moved along the eaves, and the creek was somewhere in the dark, coming down from its high water, and neither of them spoke for a long moment, and the long moment was not empty. She said, after the long moment, that she needed to think. He said that was fair. He picked up his pen, and she picked up her mending, and they sat by the lamp until the hour was late, and the silence between them was the same good silence it had been before he said the 3 words, which told him something. If the words had been wrong, the silence would have changed quality. It had not. He banked the stove, and she said good night and went upstairs. And he went to his own room and lay in the dark and thought about the 3 words and whether they had been the right ones, and decided they had been the only ones, which was close enough to write to sleep on. She was up before him the next morning, same as the others. The stove was going and the coffee was on, and she was already in the barn when he came downstairs. He had half expected to come down to a kitchen with a note and her 2 trunks moved to the porch, the way a person who has been startled by an offer tends to organize their departure. The kitchen had no note. The stove was right. The barn sounds told him she was in with the horses. He went to the barn. She was measuring out the morning grain with the grain scoop from the 3rd hook, which was where he kept it, and which she had found on the 2nd morning without being told. She looked at him when he came in, and she said, "The creek will be down by tomorrow." "Yes," he said. "The Mead Road will be passable." "It will." She set the scoop back. She looked at the barn door and the gray light coming through it and the horses at their stalls. "I have not been in one place long enough in 7 months to understand what it would feel like to stop," she said. "I have been going somewhere or leaving somewhere or managing something since March. I think I was afraid of what would happen if I stopped." He leaned against the stall post and listened without making it a response. He was a man who understood that some things had to be said the whole way through before they could be answered, and this was one of those things. "This is the first 3 days I have stopped," she said. She looked at the morning coming in the barn door. "It has not been what I was afraid of." She looked at him. "It's a good barn," she said. "It is," he said. "The house has 4 rooms and 3 of them are empty. Yes, the kitchen garden is a wreck." The corner of his mouth moved. "I know that. That would bother me considerably," she said. "I expect it would." She looked at him the way she had looked at the broken axle, and the house on the first afternoon, and everything she had been deciding whether to inhabit for 3 days. He had said what he had to say. Now it was hers, and he waited without making it harder than it was. "I need to write to my sister," she said. "She's expecting me. There's paper and ink in the desk." She nodded. She picked up the feed bucket and looked at the stalls. "Tell me what each horse needs," she said. "I'll do the feeding while you tell me." He told her, each one, and she did the feeding as he talked. Thomas first, who needed a lighter hand with the grain measure, then the mare, who would eat the bucket bottom if you let her, and when it was done they went in for breakfast, and she sat down at the desk while he reviewed the accounts, and she wrote the letter to her sister. And neither of them said anything further because nothing further needed to be said yet. The letter was sealed and addressed to Mead before the coffee was done. The wagon axle was replaced the following week, a job that required a day's trip to Granger for the right hub and axle stock, and a half-day's work in the yard that Owen did himself, while Celia held the wheel and handed tools without being asked which tool was next, which told him she had watched this kind of work before and understood the sequence. When it was done, the wagon was sound. The mead road was passable. The horses were rested, and the weather had moderated, and there was no practical reason the wagon should stay in the barn. It stayed in the barn. Neither of them mentioned it. November became December. She cleared the kitchen garden before the hard freeze, working from the outside and across 3 cold mornings, hauling out the season's wreckage with the focused quiet of a woman who is thinking something through and has found the right task for her hands while her mind does its work. He let her work and hauled the debris when the pile got unwieldy and asked no questions about the process. The garden came out clean. She stood at the edge of it when it was done and looked at the turned beds for a moment and then went inside. December came in hard and settled in. She managed the house with the efficiency of a woman who has managed houses and knows what winter requires and does not need to be reminded the stove banked right, the provisions tracked, the wash done before the cold made water a problem. He managed the land and the stock. They met in the kitchen 3 times a day and talked about the things that needed talking about and some things that didn't need to be talked about but were worth talking about anyway. Which was, he came to think, the most reliable way to learn a person. He learned that she had opinions about cattle that were not common knowledge. He learned that she slept badly on windy nights and was up by 4 on those mornings and dealt with it by starting the bread. He learned that she had a way of going still when she was deciding something, a quality of absolute stillness like a cat before it moves, and that whatever came after the stillness was generally correct. She told him about Arthur in January, on a night when the wind was serious and the stove was the whole of the warmth in the world, and there was nowhere to be but here. Not the debts first, she was matter-of-fact about those later, without drama, the way she was matter-of-fact about most things, but Arthur himself first. Who he had been. The good years, which had been genuinely good, the last 2 years, which had been the kind of difficult that is hard to name without sounding unkind to the dead. The particular quality of a grief that is complicated because the thing you lost was itself complicated, and you do not know how to mourn something cleanly when your feelings about it were not clean. He listened the way he listened to everything she said, without making it a response, until she was done. He told her about Missouri, and why he had left, and what he had been trying to build here, and why the house had 4 rooms he had built for a life that had not yet materialized. He had not said any of it to another person in 2 years, and it came out plainly, the way things come out when the person listening is not going to make more of them than they are. She was quiet when he finished. She looked at him. "You built a house for someone you hadn't met yet," she said. "I had met her," he said. "I just hadn't found her yet." She looked at the lamp and then at the window where the January dark was pressing the glass and not getting through. "Owen," she said. He waited. That was a well-made thing to say. "It's what I meant." "I know," she said. "That's why it was well made." They married in February, in Granger, at the county clerk's office, the same road as the Axel trip but a different errand, and both of them in their good clothes, and Celia with her hair done the way she had not done it since March. She had not thought about that until she was doing it, and then she had thought about it, and then she had decided that this was a different occasion than the one in March, and deserved to be treated differently, and she had finished pinning it and gone downstairs. She had written to her sister 3 times. The sister had been surprised in the first letter, and considerably less surprised in the second, and entirely unsurprised in the third, which was the one that contained the February plans. She had written back to say she was glad, and that she had not, if she was honest, been planning to give up the spare room anyway. Celia had read this to Owen at the breakfast table, and he had said good, and returned to his eggs, which was the right response and exactly what she had expected. The kitchen garden was still waiting. It would be ready in spring with the right starts. She had compiled the list over the winter, working from memory of what had been there and what she wanted to add, and Owen had read through it and said it seemed comprehensive. She had said it was. On the evening they came back from Granger, she stood at the window of the upstairs room, the room she had slept in when she was stranded, which was now a different kind of room, and she looked out at the property in the February dark. The barn. The south fence line, straight and sound. The flat land running south toward the Mead Road, 4 miles out, and somewhere in that dark the place where the axle had broken on a Thursday afternoon in November and deposited her on a road with 2 horses and a rocking chair and a clear view of how few options she had. Owen came and stood beside her. She had not been afraid on that road. She had noted the absence of the fear she expected and understood it as information. She had already lost the worst thing. The road and the axle and the flat gray sky were a problem, and a problem was not the worst thing. What she had not known, riding toward the cottonwoods on the bay, was that the road and the axle were also something else. She had not had the word for it then. She had it now. They were an opening. A door in the middle of a flat November road that had opened because the axle broke in the right place at the right hour. Close enough to a fence line a man was working, on a property he had built for a life he had not yet found. She thought about all the places the axle could have broken. 4 miles earlier. 4 miles later. A different road in a different county on a different Thursday. "Do you ever think about it?" she said. That afternoon. "Yes," he said. "I wasn't afraid. I keep thinking I should have been." He was quiet a moment. "I think you were past the kind of afraid that road could make you," he said. She looked at the barn and the fence and the 4 miles to the south. "Yes," she said. "That's exactly right." He did not say anything else. There was nothing else to say. She leaned against him slightly. Not much, just enough, the particular lean of a person who has decided something will hold and is testing the decision gently. And the February dark held the land, and inside the house was warm, and the kitchen garden was waiting, and the 4 rooms were no longer empty. And out there, somewhere in the dark, was a stretch of the Mead Road with a rut in it that had, in the right way at the right moment, changed everything.